Fantastic. So again, thank you so much for coming to this final session. So today we're going to be talking about disseminating your findings. And for me, this is one of the most important things we can really talk about, and one of the most important things in relation to research that we can do. So we're going to cover today, hopefully by the end of the session, you'll be able to know what to consider when deciding what to do with your research. You'll be able to understand how to make your research count and be able to understand the processes involved in dissemination. So dissemination refers to the act of spreading information widely. This is possibly, well, like as I said, this is possibly one of the most important parts of any research project, because it's making sure the information you produce as part of your research ends up in the hands of the right people, people who can make a difference. So what is good dissemination? One of the first things to think about is your primary audience. Who do you want to know about your research? If your research is about how effective a service is, then your audience might be service managers or service users. And you want to think about how you can engage them in your project from the get-go, and then you already have a ready audience when you have findings ready to share. You need to think about the format, which we'll talk about a few different formats here today, most of which are written. But there are lots of different ways you can share your work, and you don't have to just stick to one. You need to use the opportunities presented to you. Think about, are there other networks you can, other organisations you can network with to share information? And are there people you already know that might benefit from your findings? And finally, context. It's really important to be conscious of the service context of your research or the environment surrounding your findings. If you're researching, say, local authority policy making, it might be useful to consider how wider events like the general election might impact how information is shared and received. So I'm going to start by talking about academic publication. And as I started writing this section, I realised that there might be a fair few phrases that you might not have heard before, so I'll try and explain them before we really get into it. And I'll start with open access. So most journals are something you have to pay to read, and we talked about this a little bit in earlier sessions when we talked about subscriptions to databases and things like that. You or your institution need to have a paid subscription to be able to read articles and the research published in them. When something is open access, this just means that it's available to anyone and everyone without the need for a subscription. Most journals, you have to pay to allow for your article to be open access, and the amount you pay will depend on the journal you're publishing in and the level of open access that you're going for. And there's normally two distinct levels, and they are gold and green. So gold open access means that something is permanently and freely available online for anyone, anywhere to read at any time. Whereas green means that your article can be shared on your institutional repository free of charge. So you can post an earlier version of your manuscript or something like that to your institutional repository, which for most universities is something like Pure, and then people can access it free there. But if they want to access it through the journal, then they still need to pay. The next phrase will be impact factor. This comes up a lot when we're talking about journals. And this is really just a measure of how often the average article from a specific journal is cited or referenced during a particular period. So essentially, it's a measure of how useful the average article in a specific journal is for contributing to other discourse. A journal impact factor of 1 means that on average, the articles published 1 or 2 years ago have been cited once since. And an impact factor of, say, 35 means that on average, the articles have been cited 35 times in a specific period. And finally, peer review. And this refers to the sort of independent assessment of your research paper by experts in your field. So peer review, that's a bit of a complicated process. So I'll talk you through briefly the peer review and publication process. And you start by writing up your article. Different journals will have different word limits and different formatting requirements. So make sure before you start writing up or when you're looking to submit, you've managed to meet all of those. When you submit your article to a journal, then the editor will do what's called a desk review. And at this point, they're checking to see whether your article matches the scope of the journal and fits all of the other journal criteria. Some articles will be rejected at this stage. But if it's not rejected, then the editor will send that article onto experts in the same topic as what you've written about. This can be a blind review, which means that you don't know who the reviewers are and they don't know who you are, or it can be an open review where everyone's quite open and everyone knows who's doing what. Each journal should have the information on their website about the peer review process they operate, and that should be in quite a bit of detail. The reviewers will look at your article, and depending on the scope of the journal, they will be asked to comment in detail about the relevance, the quality, how appropriate your methods are, if it's important, or if it contributes novel information to your specific area. They might also think about ethical considerations and how appropriate your conclusions are. Once the reviews are complete and returned to the editor, a decision will then be made about publication. And this will either be manuscript accepted and published, which is fantastic. It's when we all celebrate and have a party. It might be manuscript rejected. And if this happens, there may be comments explaining why this was rejected. Sometimes there'll be a suggestion of other places you could attempt to publish this where it may fit better. Or they'll say that it needs revision or needs some improvements before they can publish. At this point, you'll be given specific comments to address in your manuscript before resubmitting, and these can be simple things like grammar or more complicated areas like adding to your discussion and methods. And you'll then need to action these comments and then resubmit. It's possible for this to happen more than once, and it can be a bit of a cyclical process sometimes. But responding to peer review involves a submitted response document that goes through each of the review comments point by point and explains how you've addressed each comment and how you've addressed each area for improvement, or why you've not addressed something if you feel that you don't need to. A clean version of your manuscript and a version with track changes will also need to be submitted to highlight the changes made. So the peer review process has its difficulties, and it's possible for reviewers to agree, but this is sometimes where there's really good opportunities for learning. And so last December, Amy and I open reviewed an article for HRB Open Research. And as part of the open process, the reviewer names and feedback are all publicly available. And this can be really useful if you're thinking about submitting and you're not sure about what the sort of feedback and comments are like and how to address them. Having a look on places that do open reviews can be a really good way of learning how that process works. So I definitely recommend having a look and seeing what the peer review feedback is like. So for this particular article we reviewed, 3 reviews were conducted, all of which disagreed. As you can see, 1 was approved with reservations or revisions, 1 outright accepted, and 1 rejected. I personally found this really interesting because we could read the feedback from the other reviewers and see where they disagreed with us, or what comments they felt needed improvement that we hadn't picked up on, or other areas. And this is great because you really get to see other people's points and perspectives and broaden your own in the process, which is the entire point of peer review. It's not necessarily to point out flaws and faults, but to highlight differences in perspective and knowledge that can ultimately improve the evidence being produced. So you might wonder why I'm saying this. It might not feel massively important in regards to dissemination, but it's because going through the peer review process can be really, really difficult. If you spend ages writing a research paper about a piece of research that you've really put everything into, and then someone critiques it, it can feel very personal and it can feel a bit like an attack. And it's important to remember that it's not meant that way, and that's not what the purpose of the process is. There just might be things you haven't considered, and incorporating those into your work where relevant could improve the quality and impact of your work. So when it comes to finding journals, it can be fairly easy. I normally start by looking at where articles similar to what I'm trying to publish have been published, or thinking about who reads what journals. I also might look to see if there are specific journals that cater to directly to my subject. And more importantly, you need to make sure it's relevant to the paper you're trying to submit. So I mentioned impact factor earlier. I was going to try and merge three words together then. So it's also known as journal impact factor. This can be an indicator of how widely read or popular a journal is or the quality of the work published. However, it does have some flaws. When the calculation for impact factor is completed, it includes non-research articles as well as research articles, so editorials and things like that. And at a glance, this may not seem like a massive issue, but a large amount of these has been shown to boost impact factor considerably. And if the citations that are going into this calculation come from non-research items, then it may mean that a high impact factor does not really reflect good quality original research. Impact factor is measured over a specific period of time, so it only covers a small fraction of citations. So that means it may not really be fit for all different academic disciplines, as different disciplines tend to achieve their citations over different time periods. So for a paper in psychology, it might take 13 years to achieve 50% of their citations, but that's a lot less in sort of biomedical research. So when you're looking at impact factor for journals, you might find that a psychology journal has an impact factor of 1 and a biomedical research journal has an impact factor of 3, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily less impactful in their own disciplines. Additionally, not all papers are cited equally. If one journal has a paper that's cited 100 times and then 50 papers that aren't cited at all, then that's going to skew the impact factor. It also doesn't account for interdisciplinary differences. So as I said before, it's kind of difficult to assess whether one journal in psychology is more impactful than a journal in biomedical research, for example. And finally, over the past 20 years, the impact factor has risen considerably, but this doesn't necessarily mean that the quality or impact have actually improved. There's more journals, more researchers, more citations. There's more going on. And as a proportion, the overall users of journals, it probably hasn't changed that much. But this probably needs researching if anyone watching fancies doing that. So impact factor can be a useful metric for identifying articles with a wider reach, but it should not be the main influencing factor when you're choosing a journal. There's lots of other metrics that we don't have time to talk about today, and these are just one of the many things you should consider when choosing. So you could also think about audience, the reach, open access, the costs, and the speed of publication. So again, it can be difficult to know where to submit your article to, and different journals will have different remits and will want to publish different things. So for example, we will hopefully be publishing or trying to publish the realist synthesis that we're completing at the moment. And for this, there's a number of different journals we could submit to. We could aim for the British Journal of Social Work, which is closely associated with the British Association of Social Workers, and has an excellent reputation for publishing really good quality research. We could also try and submit to the Journal of Integrated Care, which covers more how different agencies work or collaborate to deliver holistic care, and has a more practical flair. Or we could submit to Social Work, which is associated with the National Association of Social Workers in the US. And obviously these are only 3 options, but who we choose to submit to will specify who is likely to see our research. Different people will read these journals and they'll have a slightly different focus. And our research, whilst it talks about collaborative working, it does have a social work focus. So maybe we might find that we need to focus on a more social work-based journal. And you'll notice that I haven't included the impact factor on this slide. And these are all journals that I'm already aware of and have been cited. And I've cited multiple articles from them multiple times. And this is particularly important because of predatory journals. So A predatory journal is one that takes advantage of the sort of open access publishing model by charging publication fees without providing the same standards of peer review or editing services. They'll often claim to be open access with the peer review process, but they might not actually be, and they don't necessarily have adequate peer reviewing. Because of the fraudulent peer review process, articles with flawed research or communication issues don't necessarily receive the benefit of peer feedback before publication, and then they therefore can be published with inaccurate information or deliberately false information, which would normally be picked up in peer review. So this can kind of allow misinformation and issues to enter the wider research community. Additionally, if you publish your research in a low quality journal, it may make your research harder to find. Because fraudulent journals are generally deemed to be sort of low quality and untrustworthy, researchers are less likely to browse for those journals or to read them on their own. And also many databases do not index them. So if you think back to earlier sessions when we were talking about different databases and what we might use to search for our research, for our literature, if the journal you submit to is not published, is not indexed in one of those databases, then your research is less likely to be found. So when picking a journal, think to yourself, is the peer review process clearly stated on the website? Does the website clearly state the publishing fees? Is the journal indexed in databases you use? And are there any spelling or grammatical issues on their website or in their emails? And you'll find that once you do submit or once you do get published, you'll suddenly start getting lots of spam emails from journals like from predatory journals. These are some of them I've received recently. Aside from the spelling and grammatical or other issues, say, I'm not a professor and I quite enjoyed Dr. and Mrs. Fulliger, that did make me smile. None of these are related to my area of expertise, so it's already a bit suspicious that they're trying to contact me for publications. Your other option is through professional publications, and I won't talk about this too much because all the sort of different requirements will be quite different. But you do have options for disseminating your research and your knowledge throughout professional publications. These often have less rigorous publishing procedures. They won't necessarily have peer review or issues with open access and things like that. But they're much more likely to reach a more practical rather than a more academic audience. You may have to do a bit of digging for these as they'll be discipline specific, and it's really good to think about who you want to be finding your research and who you want to be reading it. The other option for dissemination is Parliament. Engaging with Parliament is particularly useful in research, and it can be a really excellent way of getting the findings from your research heard, particularly if your findings relate to policy. When MPs and the like are developing their policies and bills, they usually do this based on some kind of evidence, but they don't always go out and find it themselves. So engaging with Parliament and specifically telling them what your research adds or how it can help means that your research is more likely to contribute to the development of policies. Your research might be able to support parliamentarians to evaluate the work of government. So, for example, if we think about the recent contaminated blood scandal, considerable research will have been used to support the inquiry team to understand the implications of all the different aspects of that. Engaging with Parliament presents lots of opportunities to sort of grow your network and engage with new opportunities that you might not have otherwise. One of the ways you can engage with Parliament and disseminate your knowledge that way is through post notes, and I really like these. These are short, peer-reviewed evidence briefings. They're normally around 40 pages, so when I say short, that's relative. And they're about emerging areas of research, and they're produced by the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, which is POST. These are used by MPs or people in the House of Lords or parliamentary staff to navigate and understand complex research issues. So, for example, with the infected blood inquiry, MPs and others may have used a post note to understand current knowledge around haemophilia and different treatments. So I like to think of these as sort of little cheat sheets. They give you information that's up to date about current issues. They're also really interesting to sit and browse through. So they're just sort of little bite-sized summaries of complex topics. The Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology compiles notes on different topics at different times, depending on what's going on in Parliament. When I was writing this seminar, they're currently calling for evidence relating to North Sea decommissioning and personalised medicines and inherited blood diseases. So if you've got anything to add to those, you might be waiting for a relevant topic for a while, but it's always worth signing up to the update emails and just keeping an eye out. Another way to engage is through select committees. So select committees are either members of the House of Commons or the House of Lords who have been asked by the government to consider policy issues or scrutinise government work or activity and examine proposals for primary and secondary legislation. So this, again, if you're doing policy-based research or anything that has the potential to impact policy, this might be really useful when select committees are investigating legislative changes. Finding active select committees can be a bit tricky as they're not permanent groups. When they're set up, they all have their own websites and their own Twitter accounts that then go dormant once the committee is finished. It will only exist for as long as they're investigating that specific topic. However, it's easy to see what committees are active if you go to committees.parliament.uk. At the moment, there's no committees accepting written evidence because of the new government in place. They're yet to appoint or reappoint committee members, and all committees automatically cease to exist when Parliament dissolves. So they're just being reappointed at the moment. But it's worth checking up. Once you find a committee relevant to your work that's accepting evidence, there will be a call for evidence document that you should read before submitting. And this outlines what kind of evidence they're looking for, and you can decide whether or not your evidence fits that criteria. That will be what the button looks like on the website when they're accepting evidence. Once the committees have reviewed the evidence and produced their report, the evidence will be published along with the report itself. So, for example, a select committee published this report on adult social care in December 2022. And I can see that there's transcripts of oral evidence that was listened to and taken into account for this report, and also the submissions of a variety of people that submitted evidence of some kind to be considered for this report. It's also worth pointing out that whilst this seminar is about disseminating research findings, you don't have to be a researcher or even have findings to contribute evidence to a select committee. If you do have personal experience you think would be beneficial to a select committee, you can write this up and submit it, but they won't be able to assist you with any personal problems. It will just be in a way of providing evidence for them to consider. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of dissemination. Hopefully now you know what to consider when deciding what to do with your research. You need to think about what you want to happen with it and who you want to know about it. Understand different ways of making your research count, either by contributing to wider discourse or by getting involved with policy decisions, and understanding the processes involved in dissemination. And this is where I'll get a little bit serious for a minute, because as I said at the beginning, dissemination is really crucially important. We always talk about amazing research that's happening and these incredible useful findings that have come out of research, and then nothing happens. And that nothing happens because we may not be very good at effectively disseminating that knowledge and those findings. We can do all this amazing research and we can solve these really big issues, but if we don't disseminate that information, no one would ever know and nothing would ever change. So when you conduct research, you're creating information and knowledge that no one else knows about unless you tell them. So the onus is on you to make sure that the research you have done is meaningful and worthwhile. Whether you do this through published papers or blogs or podcasts or conference talks or YouTube videos or going on the news, just get the information out there and talk about it to everyone and tell everyone what you've done. So there's some further reading which when I post the seminar slides, you'll be able to click through all these links. And then finally, we'd really appreciate it if you could scan this lovely QR code and complete a small series of questions for some feedback. And also, we wondered, while we've got some time sort of left over, if there's any questions or anything you'd like to sort of talk about in a little bit more detail whilst we're here. If you've got any questions, either just shout out or pop them in the chat. Thank you very much, Thomas. That's fine. What I will do is I will stop this recording. I can remember how.